The message arrived at 8:17 on a Friday night. Girls' night. Don't wait up. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, not because the words surprised me, but because they didn't. After 10 years of marriage, you learn the difference between a message someone sends because they're busy and a message they send because they're already gone. A few minutes earlier, I'd been standing in our bedroom doorway, watching my wife, Sophia, apply lipstick in front of the mirror. The soft yellow light above the vanity reflected off the black dress she'd chosen. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't revealing. But it wasn't the kind of dress she'd ever worn for dinner with friends. She caught me looking. "What?" she asked, forcing a smile. "Nothing," I said. "You just look different tonight." She laughed quietly and reached for her clutch bag. "Ethan, don't start analyzing everything. It's just a girls' night." Just a girls' night. Funny how certain phrases change meaning after you've heard them enough times. She walked toward me, kissed my cheek, and for a brief second I almost believed her. Almost. But then I looked into her eyes. People think lies happen in words. They don't. They happen in the tiny pauses between them. "Don't wait up," she said again. Then she walked out the front door. A few seconds later, I heard her car pull away. The house became silent. Not peaceful silent. The kind of silence that makes you realize you've been living alone long before anyone actually leaves. I sat on the couch and turned on the television. The sound stayed muted. Images flashed across the screen while my mind replayed the last 4 months. The late-night meetings. The phone turned face down. The sudden smiles while texting. The unexplained distance. The way she'd stopped reaching for my hand in public. At first, I'd blamed stress. Then work. Then myself. That's the dangerous thing about loving someone deeply. You become willing to rewrite reality if it means keeping them. My phone rested beside me. I picked it up. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Then I opened the location-sharing app. Sophia believed I'd removed access months ago after we'd argued about privacy. I had told her I did. I hadn't. The map loaded. A single blue dot appeared downtown. My stomach tightened, not because she was there, because I recognized where there was. The Velvet Room. I actually laughed. Not loudly, not angrily, just enough to acknowledge the irony. 2 years earlier, she'd called that place desperate and embarrassing. Now she was spending Friday night there. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes. Strangely, I didn't feel rage. Rage requires uncertainty. And uncertainty had disappeared weeks ago. Around 9:30, my phone vibrated again. A message from Sophia. "Might stay at Natalie's tonight. Don't wait for me." No heart emoji, no love you. Just a sentence. Cold, efficient, final. I read it 3 times. Then I stood up and walked to the kitchen. The whiskey bottle sat untouched on the counter. I poured a glass and stared out the window into the darkness. A memory surfaced. The previous Saturday. Her car. The leather wallet I'd found wedged beneath the passenger seat. The wallet belonging to Daniel, her coworker. The same coworker she'd insisted was basically a brother. I remembered holding that wallet in my hand for nearly 10 minutes, not because I didn't know what it meant, because I knew exactly what it meant. And suddenly, after 4 months of silence, excuses, and pretending, I felt something unexpected. Peace. I picked up my phone, opened our conversation, and typed a single sentence. Then I stared at it for a long time before pressing send. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in months, I knew one thing for certain. I was finally done waiting. I pressed send. The message was simple. "Tell Daniel I said hello. He left his wallet in your car last Saturday." For a few seconds, nothing happened. The screen remained still. The 3 words I'd written sat there without emotion, without explanation, without anger. I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and took a slow sip of whiskey. Outside, the night remained perfectly ordinary. Inside, everything had changed. I walked back into the living room and sat down. The television still flickered silently. Somewhere in the city, Sophia was reading that message. Somewhere in the city, the version of our marriage she'd been carefully maintaining was collapsing. My phone rang. Her name flashed across the screen. I watched it vibrate until it stopped. Then it rang again, and again. By the 6th call, I realized something strange. I didn't feel satisfaction. I didn't feel revenge. I just felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after carrying someone else's secrets for too long. The calls kept coming, 10, 15, 20. I muted the phone and leaned my head back. A memory returned without warning. 3 years earlier, we'd taken a weekend trip to the coast. We'd spent hours walking along the beach, laughing about nothing important. That night, she'd fallen asleep with her head on my chest and whispered, "Promise me we'll never become one of those couples who stop trying." At the time I'd promised, now I wondered when she'd stopped, or perhaps the harder question was when I'd started pretending not to notice. The phone buzzed again. A message. "Ethan, please answer." Then another. "It's not what you think." I laughed softly. Those words. No one ever says them before they're caught. A third message arrived. "I'm coming home. Please wait for me. Please wait for me." For months, she'd been asking me not to. I looked around the house we'd built together. The photographs on the shelves, the books we'd bought, the furniture we'd argued over and eventually agreed upon. People imagine betrayal arrives like an explosion. It doesn't. It arrives quietly. One compromise. One lie. One unanswered question. Until one day, you look around and realize the life you believed in no longer exists. Headlights swept across the front window. I glanced at the clock. 10 minutes. She'd driven home in 10 minutes. Apparently, honesty had never motivated her quite that much. The front door burst open. Sophia stood there, breathing hard. Her hair was disheveled. Her makeup had smeared beneath her eyes. She looked less like someone returning from a night out and more like someone fleeing a disaster. "Ethan," she gasped. "Please." I remained seated. She stepped closer. "You have to listen to me." I set my glass down carefully. "I'm listening." She swallowed. "Daniel was there tonight, but it wasn't planned." The sentence hung in the air. Not planned. As though planning had ever been the problem. "He just showed up," she continued quickly. "I didn't know he'd be there." I nodded slowly. "What an extraordinary coincidence." She flinched. "I barely spoke to him." I studied her face. For years, I'd known every expression she made. I'd known when she was happy, afraid, embarrassed, exhausted. Tonight, I learned something else. I knew when she was lying. "Interesting," I said quietly. "He found enough time to leave his wallet in your car." The color drained from her face. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "You went through my car?" I stood up. "No." My voice surprised even me. It wasn't angry. It was empty. "I went through the lies you left inside it." Her eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, please." And in that moment, watching the woman I'd loved for 10 years standing in front of me, terrified and broken, I realized something devastating. I no longer needed her explanation. Because somewhere along the way, I'd already accepted the truth. And once acceptance arrives, there is no going back. Sophia lowered herself onto the couch as though her legs could no longer support her. For the first time since she'd walked through the door, she stopped trying to control the situation. She simply looked afraid. "Ethan," she whispered, wiping at her eyes, "I know what this looks like." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because that sentence had become a ritual for people caught between truth and consequences. "What does it look like?" I asked quietly. She stared at the floor. "It looks like I betrayed you." The honesty of the statement caught me off guard, not because it changed anything, because it was the first honest thing she'd said all night. The room fell silent. Outside, a car passed slowly down our street. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary life. It was strange how the world continued moving while your own life came apart. "I never planned for any of this," she said eventually. I sat across from her. "Then when did it start?" She closed her eyes. "I don't know." "Try," she drew in a shaky breath. "It started with talking." Of course it did. Every disaster begins with something small enough to justify. He listened. She continued. "You were always working. You were tired. We barely talked anymore." There it was. Not an excuse. An explanation. People often confuse the two. I nodded slowly. "So instead of talking to me, you talked to him." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "At first, yes, and after that?" She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any confession could. "We had lunch a few times. I waited." "And?" "We texted." "I waited again." The truth is patient. Eventually, everyone tells it. She looked up at me with eyes I'd once trusted more than my own. I liked how he made me feel. The sentence landed harder than I expected, not because I hadn't known, because hearing it spoken aloud transformed suspicion into reality. I stood and walked toward the window. The glass reflected my face back at me. I looked older than I remembered. Maybe betrayal ages people. Or maybe disappointment does. Behind me, Sophia was crying. "I never wanted to hurt you. I kept my eyes on the darkness outside." That's the problem. She fell silent. "You didn't want to hurt me," I continued. "You just wanted something else more." The room became very still. For months, I'd imagined this conversation. I'd imagined yelling, breaking things, demanding answers. Instead, all I felt was grief. Not for our marriage, for the man I'd been while trying to save it. "Ethan," she whispered. Nothing physical happened. I turned around. She looked desperate now, as though those words could rebuild something already destroyed. I swear, I believed her. That was the worst part. I actually believed her. Because she still didn't understand. "The physical part isn't what ended us," I said quietly. She stared at me. "Then what did?" I walked back toward the couch and sat down across from her. "The moment you started giving someone else the parts of yourself that belonged in this room." She covered her mouth and began to sob. Not dramatically. Not performatively. Like someone realizing that consequences don't arrive all at once. They arrive one memory at a time. "I can fix this," she whispered. I looked around the house we'd built together. The photographs. The bookshelves. The framed picture from our honeymoon. The future we'd planned. Then I looked back at her. "No," I said gently. The words seemed to break something inside her. She shook her head. "Please don't say that." But I already had, and for the first time in months I knew I meant it. I stood up and walked toward the bedroom. A few seconds later, I heard her footsteps behind me. "Ethan," she cried. "What are you doing?" I opened the closet door and reached for my suitcase. The suitcase felt heavier than it should have, not because of what I packed, because of what I was leaving behind. Behind me, Sophia stood frozen in the bedroom doorway. The tears had stopped. Sometimes people stop crying when they finally understand that words no longer have power. Ethan, she said softly, please don't do this tonight. I folded a shirt carefully and placed it inside the suitcase. When would you prefer? I asked. The question wasn't cruel. That was what made it hurt. She stepped closer. We can go to counseling. We can talk. We can start over. I paused. For years, those words would have meant everything to me. Now they sounded like a conversation arriving months too late. Do you know what I've been doing for the last 4 months? I asked. She didn't answer. I've been waiting. I closed the suitcase, waiting for you to tell me the truth, waiting for you to choose us, waiting for you to remember that I mattered. She lowered her eyes. I was scared. I nodded. I know. That was the tragedy of it. I believed her. Fear makes people do terrible things. So does loneliness. So does the need to feel wanted. But understanding someone's reasons doesn't erase the damage they caused. She reached for my hand. I love you. The words hung in the room between us. Once, hearing them would have been enough to keep me there. Once, I looked at the woman I'd built a decade of my life around. The woman who had celebrated birthdays with me, buried family members with me, dreamed about growing old with me. And I realized something painful. I still loved who she had been. I just didn't recognize who she had become. Or perhaps, if I was being honest, who we'd both become. If you loved me, I said quietly, you would have talked to me before you talked to someone else. Her face crumpled. I made a mistake. I picked up the suitcase. No. She looked up. You made a series of choices. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then she began to cry again. Not the desperate crying from earlier. Not the crying of someone trying to avoid consequences. The crying of someone realizing that consequences had already arrived. Please, she whispered. Don't leave. I walked past her. At the front door, I stopped. Not because I was reconsidering. Because endings deserve honesty. I hope you're happy one day, Sophia. She stared at me. What about us? I opened the door. There isn't an us anymore. Then I left. I spent that night in a hotel on the other side of the city. I didn't sleep. Not because I regretted leaving. Because grief doesn't disappear the moment you make the right decision. By morning, I had 47 missed calls. 19 text messages. 3 voice notes. I didn't listen to any of them. Some things, once broken, don't need further explanation. 2 weeks later, I filed for separation. She fought for us. Or perhaps, she fought for the version of us she realized she was losing. She came to my office once. She held my hands and cried. She told me I was her everything. I remember looking at her and feeling something unexpected. Not anger, not hatred. Sadness, because if I had truly been everything, she never would have needed someone else to make her feel whole. That was the last time I saw her. Months later, I heard through mutual friends that she'd repeated the same pattern in another relationship. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel victorious. I simply felt grateful. Grateful that the truth had arrived before I spent years pretending not to see it. People still ask me why I'm single. I usually smile. Because the answer isn't that I lost someone, it's that I finally stopped losing myself trying to keep someone who had already let go. And sometimes, late at night, I think back to that message. Don't wait up. She thought it was permission to leave. She never realized it would become the reason I finally learned to walk away.